Last night, Father Tom was restricted to the AMBO, but through the modern technology, we've been able to advance since last night. And this is great for two reasons. One, now I can move around when singing lounge tunes. Somewhere beyond the sea. I'm here all night, everyone. And also because I can't stand still. So it's good for those two reasons. What I want to do with you tonight is reflect on this image of the story of the prodigal son that we heard. And you probably have seen this all over the place. You've seen it on our worship aids, you saw it on our posters for the mission. It's kind of been smattered all over the place. So what I'd like to do with you tonight is to reflect on this very familiar parable of the prodigal son in depth. And look at each of the three figures that we find in this gospel passage: the younger son, the older son, and the father. And in reflecting on them, hopefully see where our relationship is with God in relation to that story. And as you're in your worship aid, that you know that gospel's right there, so feel free to take copious notes of my revolutionary ideas and take it home with you. If you want to write anything down, note to self, like, don't come to the next Father Allen talk. Feel free to do that so you remind yourself of that. So I want to go through that story, reflect on those characters, and then at the end use that as a springboard for looking at our life of prayer. And I'm going to give you 6 tips at the end, 6 incredibly practical tips on how to be holy, how to become holy. So stay tuned for that. So first of all, we have this story of the prodigal son. We hear about this younger son. We hear it begins, the man had 2 sons. And the younger of the son went to his father and said, "Father, give me the share of my inheritance that should come to me." Now there's a couple things going on here. First of all, the son only sees his father as someone who gives him stuff. Like a sugar daddy. Like, "Dad, give me this. Give me money. Give me car keys. Give me this. Give me that." So he's already coming to the situation with a limited view of his father. Father is the one who gives him stuff. And how often do us in our own lives look to God as like an aspirin God? When we're sick, go to God, give me my aspirin, give me the medicine I need. Or, "God, here, I've made this mess, you come fix it." Or, "God, I really need help with this test that I haven't studied for, so come help me out here," right? We can come to God with that sort of give me image. And that changes how we understand our relationship with God. The second thing to note is that here he says, "Give me a share of my inheritance that's due me." He's feeling entitlement. But he's also saying, "Dad, I wish you were dead. Dad, you're dead to me. You don't matter. Our relationship isn't important to me." So he's doing a very radical thing. And what's crazy is that the father responds by giving him exactly what he asks for. Giving him the share of his inheritance. The generosity of the father would have shocked the first listeners of this parable. But here's the problem. The son has a false understanding of what freedom is. He believes that freedom, in the false freedom, a freedom from. And Pope Benedict XVI, in his book, this first book, Jesus of Nazareth, talks about this false freedom that the prodigal son has. Now stop me if you've ever heard any of this. "I'd be fine if I could just get out of this job. If I could get out of this marriage. If I could get out of this friendship. It would be great if I could just get away from it all. If I could leave all that behind. Just cut off ties with everyone. Go live on some tropical desert island, Find myself." So often we think of freedom as getting away from everything, of cutting those ties or those relationships. But what we'll find out later on is that's not exactly the right idea of freedom. That's a false freedom. That's not real. We don't find freedom in cutting off those relationships, in cutting off who we are. And, we sort of have this temptation in our culture to just do it. The high schoolers would say, "YOLO, you only live once. Just go for it. Just do it. Do whatever you want. Do whatever makes you feel happy, right? We have this whole plethora of ideas. But really, true freedom is a freedom for. A freedom for excellence. It's looking at all this array of possibilities out in front of us and saying, how does God want me to flourish? How is God calling me to an extraordinary life of virtue? So we see this prodigal son has a false idea and understanding of freedom. We'll see more about this later on. So we hear that he goes off to a distant country. First of all, think about the Israelites who are hearing this passage. God's to be found in Israel. Why would you leave Israel? Why would you leave Dubuque? It has everything you need, right? So to leave Israel was crazy. Why would you go off to a distant country? God is to be found here. And so he goes off to this distant country, and we hear that he loses his money, squanders his money. Note, it doesn't say how. It's important. It doesn't say how he squanders his money. But he gets this job. His life goes downward. He's working on this farm, and he's looking at this pig thinking, ooh, that looks good. Move over, Bessie. I want some of that. He's jealous of pigs. And think about what that would have meant in the Jewish context. Here's an animal that's unclean. You don't even eat you wouldn't even dream of pork because it's unclean. And here's a guy who's jealous of a pig, right? How many times in our own lives have we sort of gotten to a point where we say, oh, I really want that, and we think, what in the world am I doing here? And then we hear that he comes to his senses. The Greek word is metanoia, which means to come back to himself, to return to himself. And something very important happens here. He comes to his senses, but most importantly, his conversion starts by recognizing who he is in relation to his Father. He recognizes his identity. Here he thought his freedom was found by cutting off all these ties with his dad, but his freedom and who he is found precisely in recognizing who he is in relation to God the Father. So he says, I'm going to go to my Father. I'm going to return to my Father. He comes to his senses. So too for us, who we are is found in relation to God our Father through baptism. We're his sons and daughters through baptism. So he comes to his senses. He returns to the Father. Now maybe you've had a moment like that where you've kind of walked down the wrong path and you realize, what am I doing here? I need to return. I need to come back. And I imagine that experience helped you realize what you did have, what you had lost. Or maybe it was a time in your life where you sort of drifted away from God, or maybe you're there right now. Or maybe it was an experience for those of you who are veterans when you went off to war and realized, wow, how blessed I am with the family and the freedoms I have at home. This happened to me in a sort of small way after my 4 years just up the street at Loris. I was sent to Rome for seminary. And I remember getting there, and all I had was my carry-on. My checked luggage, of course, got lost somewhere. And the trunks that I had sent 2 weeks ahead of time hadn't arrived yet, so I had like 2 shirts and a pair of socks. And so I remember just throwing that down in my room, and I thought, well, I'm going to walk down the hall, because I know that somewhere out here, there's a window over here that will look at St. Peter's. Somewhere over here. And this was the picture. This is the image that I saw. And I looked at St. Peter's, I looked out the window, and I thought, what in the heck am I doing here? Only I didn't say heck. I didn't think heck. I thought, what in the golly gee willikers am I doing here? And it was a realization of how much I love my family and how much I was going to miss them. Now, it wasn't an occasion of sin, but it's a fitting analogy that I think back in my own life when I do sin, about how the love that I had with God and with my family. And I came to appreciate my family after distancing myself from them physically. So, that's the younger son. Maybe you felt like a younger son at times. Let's fast forward in that story to the younger son. We'll come back to the father, but to the older son. Let's look at that older son for a moment. Now this older son we hear is out in the field. He's out doing the Father's work, right? He's stayed close to home. He hasn't left the Father, but he's not really close to his Father. He's out in the field is sort of an analogy for how he's interiorly distant from his Father, how he's sort of resented where he is and his relationship to his Father. Now imagine him out there in the field. This is a parable, of course, but imagine him out there in the field working all day, and the son comes home. And it would have taken a couple hours to kill this fatted calf, to kill the fatted calf, to invite the friends over, for them to pick out the set of music they were going to play that night, to invite all the neighbors over. And we can imagine after this long time, this older son hears about it from a servant. And we can imagine him thinking, well, why didn't Dad come out and tell me? I have to hear it from this guy? What's going on here? And so we can see this resentment sort of already starting to build up in him. Then he says he goes to the house, but he won't go in. He's not going to go in the house. Instead, he says, here this son of yours, this young, who returns, who swallowed up your money with prostitutes. Notice that was never said. That was never said in this gospel. He's already made assumptions about what his brother was doing. He's already made the assumption, oh, he's wasted all his money on gambling, he's wasted all his money on women, and now he comes back here. That says a lot about what's going on in his heart and the jealousy that he was experiencing. That he secretly was kind of wishing he was that younger brother who had gone off and done all those things. He was kind of wishing that that was him. He has this sort of spiritual envy, jealousy, resentment, entitlement, all at the same time. He still has the share of the property. He still will get the inheritance. But notice that here too, the father goes out to meet him. The father leaves the party behind and goes out to talk to this older son. Just like the story of the good shepherd leaving the 99 that happened just before this gospel, so the father goes out to bring in the younger son, to lavish his generosity upon him. He goes out to talk some sense into the older son. God goes out. He's constantly going out to them, meeting them where they are. And yet this older brother still feels this entitlement. He's still crippled. He'd prefer to have his brother dead. And he too has a little freedom confusion. He too thinks that freedom is this freedom from getting away, of going out there and finding it. And he has to realize, without going anywhere, that he has to discover a new freedom, that he's beloved, that he's a loved son. And there's nothing to be ashamed about that. He has to recognize his identity too in the Father's love, just like the younger son did. Whoops. There we go. Whoops. I was afraid of that. Which one of these is me? Is it this one? This one? This one? This one? Yeah, this one? That's me. And this is my friend Mason. And Mason and I were good friends growing up. And his mom and my mom were high school classmates. And Mason's mom was a really good painter. And and some of that artistic ability rubbed off on Mason there. And so one day when we were about in 3rd grade, Mason came with a gift for all of us in class. Remember, Mason is my best friend. Like, we did everything together. We had sleepovers together. I went over to his house. He went over to my house. We had great friends. And so Mason brought these gifts to school. And they were like, you know those little glass beads that you put in like flower arrangements? The little clear glass beads? They're real small. They're like smaller than a marble. Well, Mason had made one for each of our class. He didn't make it, but he painted one. He hand painted one and put all different designs on each one. So they're all unique. And Mason gave one to each of the members of my class. And so I remember getting that and thinking, wow, this is a really cool gift. This is awesome. Mason took the time to make this for me. That's really cool. And I remember after not too long after that, one of the kids next to me said, hey, check this out. And he had scratched a little bit of the paint away, and you could see the glass underneath it. I thought, well, why would you do that? It looks cool, but why would you do that? This is a gift that Mason gave us. So at recess, different people were walking around, hey, check this out. I scratched the paint off, and there's this really nice, cool bead underneath. Isn't that neat? I thought, why would you do that? And so then we got in after recess, and the teacher said, okay, I need you all to sit down, boys and girls. This morning, Mason gave us a really special gift. And Mason's just sat there with his head down, tears starting to well up in his eyes. She said, I know some of you have scratched the paint off those marbles, and I need you to raise your hand, and we're going to take the marbles back. So everyone lifted up their hand in the class. I looked down, and there was my marble, clear as day. I scratched all the paint off it too. And I very sadly raised up my hand. And I remember that day because I thought to myself, well, if anyone should not have done that, it was me. If anyone should have showed how much he loved him, it was me. And in that moment, I was a bit like that older son who had that love, who knew the love, but resented it, who didn't appreciate it, who didn't value it enough, who wasn't grateful. Maybe there's a time in your life where you've sort of felt like that, where you felt like that older son. Maybe it was when you hurt people closest to you. Maybe it was a time when you just resented your other family members, your siblings. Oh, they have it so easy. Everything gets handed to them on a gold plate. And what do I have? Look at this life I have. Or, why can't our parish be like that parish? Or my family like that family? Or our community like that community? It's the brother of resentment. And I think it's really easy for us in our spiritual lives to fall into one of these two extremes, of being the younger son or being the older son. I'll give you another example. So when I was younger, like in high school, we raised ducks, and I loved raising ducks. And then we decided after a year or two that we were going to raise geese, because I thought I persuaded Dad to get some geese. And so these geese were great, but has anyone here ever raised geese? They can get really mean and get real mean. So they started off really nice and friendly, and then they turned. They got real mean. And I'll never forget how two of them died. One of them got so angry it kept following and chasing after stuff. It kept running after things, after cats, dogs, people. And it died because it ran after the pickup. And it got run over by the pickup. And the other one, which was just as stupid, we had this little, 6 inches off the ground, this little electric fence that went around our garden. And this goose bit onto that electric fence and wouldn't let go and electrocuted itself. Had it just let go, it would have been fine, but it didn't do that. It was too stupid. But I think that's an analogy for these two brothers in the story. We can be like the younger son, that goose who chases after everything, and it gets more dangerous, and it gets more dangerous, and eventually leads us to a spiritual death. Or we can be like that older brother who holds on to this resentment and this anger and this entitlement, and then it just leads to our own and our sort of scrupulosity and our hanging on to rules, and we ourselves also die. We're sort of led down those two paths. And the challenge is to be like neither of them, is to learn. So we have this third character, the father, which might make us wonder, where is Jesus in this story? Where's he at? Well, remember, Jesus is the one who reveals the love of the Father. Jesus is the one in this gospel who shows us how much the Father loves us. So we have the Father. And we often think about this story as the story of the prodigal son. But actually, we could call it the story of the two sons. Because we hear at the beginning, a man had two sons. It doesn't say just one son. But we could also say that these two sons were prodigal. Both of them were lost. Both of them are foolish. The word prodigal means foolish. But the word prodigal can also mean lavish, foolishly generous. So it can also be this story, we could also call this the story of the prodigal father. The father who's ridiculously generous, far more generous than he needs to be. And these two sons that we hear about, if you go to the Bible and you look a verse before this gospel starts, we hear that there are the Jewish people who are coming to Jesus, but then there are also the sinners and the tax collectors are coming to Jesus, the Gentiles. So the story is meant to be a parallel between the Jewish people, those older sons who have been close to the Father, and the younger son, those who are now coming to the Father, who are now coming to Christ. So it's meant to show, no, we both need to grow. We both need to be drawn along and realize how much the Father loves us. And we realize in this story the Father's love, the family love, the love that constantly draws new people in, then calls them to communion. Father Tom talked about that last night when he used the image of his family calendar, right? And he talked about the calendar and he was wondering who's in the family this year because it gets extended and who doesn't make the cut this year. And his parents said, well, as long as they're in, unless they don't want to be anymore. That love, family love, is constantly drawing people in, holding them together. Pope Francis has a great quote that I just found. He just said it recently. Charity is creative. Love is creative. Love constantly draws new people in. It constantly is rethinking. It's constantly shaping. It's constantly including. And I just want to share with you two stories. I have of how this plays out, how we see the Father's love reflected. One was, I have a good friend in town who's a minister, not Catholic minister, and he said, you know, if someone is not married, if someone is cohabitating, I won't marry them. And I said, well, if I did that, I would not have married anyone so far. In my 2.5 years, I would have married no one. And I think, thank God they are coming, so that they are coming and we can have the conversation. That we can have that conversation in the context of love and trust and support, and we can create the space for growth to happen. Because it would be very easy to say, you know what, we're just not going to do it. To put out that hand. To hold on to that electric fence. Right? Another story, which I sort of had to grapple with recently, is a friend of mine. We'll call him Justin. And Justin and I went to Loris together. Mark Schmidt also knows Justin. We overlap too there. And Justin struggled a lot with his sexual identity in college. He really struggled with who he was in that. And recently he moved to New York. He met a guy named, we'll call him Evan. Sounds good. And they got married. And Justin recently came back about a month ago to celebrate his birthday. And we hadn't talked since any of this had happened, since he moved away to New York. And I thought to myself, well, should I go to his birthday party? Should I go? And so I wrote him a card and about, you know, where I am and where the church is and on that. And yet I said, you know what, you're my friend. And you're always going to be my friend. And I'm going to love you as my friend. And I'm going to support you. And if you ever need anything, you can call on me because I'm going to have your back. And Justin found a parish in New York where he cantors often. He's very gifted musically. And I walked away from that thinking, I'm glad. I'm glad that there was a parish where he felt welcome, where they allowed him to use his gifts and talents, that created the space for real conversation to happen. Pope Francis says in his exhortation, The Joy of the Gospel, if those real, honest conversations that are happening in love aren't happening in the parish, they're not going to happen anywhere. So how do we create that love that includes people, that is constantly calling people through hospitality to something greater. Because what happens is, the more we include others, the more we realize the older brother tendencies in ourselves. The more those come to the surface, and the more we realize, you know what? This gift of grace and faith is totally free. None of us deserve it. None of us are entitled to it. All of it is God's gift to us. It's God's goodness to us. This other quote that I really enjoy: the Catholic Church is not a country club for the righteous. It's a hospital for sinners. Pope Francis says the church is a triage unit. That's what he talks about. He says that word in The Joy of the Gospel. The church is a triage unit where we attend immediately to the person's need. Who they are and their history, that can wait. But right now we need to attend to who they are and where they're hurting. I always love that phrase. It's not a country club for the righteous, but a hospital for sinners. And the more we come to recognize the Father's love, the more we come to recognize it as a gift for all of us. Each of us have been given that free gift. And that, my friends, is when conversion happens. Conversion happens when we recognize the Father's love for us, when we allow it to move our hearts, to identify us as children. From that, prayer flows. So it's first recognition of the Father's love for us that moves us to respond, that draws us, helps us come to our senses through prayer. So, what is prayer? Prayer, as you know, is simply conversation with God. It's conversing with God. And it begins with that reality of recognizing our relationship to God. So, prayer helps us find ourselves. It says Waldo finds himself. I think the translation in Spanish was Waldo se encuentra a sí mismo. That's it. Google translated it, and I thought, that doesn't sound right. So we talk about prayer as a way that we come to know who we are. And to help us understand, I want to draw a distinction between public prayer and private prayer. Public prayer versus private prayer. Now, public prayer, obviously, the most obvious one is Mass. It's the time when we come together with all our unique gifts, offer all of our needs, our lives on the altar, so that God can transform them into His own body and blood to sustain us. So the Mass is the most obvious one. Another very obvious one is the sacraments, those places where we encounter Christ. Then we have what's called the Liturgy of the Hours. Those are what the prayers that are said by priests and religious and anyone who wants to throughout the day, either twice or 5 times or 9 times a day. Those are those prayers that are said throughout the world. So at any moment of the day, someone is praying for you. Constantly, right now as we're speaking, there are thousands of people praying for you. It's the way that the church fulfills God's command to pray always without ceasing. Okay, so that's public prayer. Then private prayer. Scripture reading. Just opening up the Bible and reflecting. The technical word is Lectio Divina, reflecting on the divine word, divine reading. Just sitting with the passage and reflecting on it. The Rosary. Now, even though we might pray the Rosary in a community, it's a private prayer. So, we might do a scripture reading in context of a couple people, but it's still a private prayer. Then also Eucharistic adoration, which we might do in a communal context, but the church talks about it as a private devotional prayer. It's a private prayer. Okay, so what we're really talking about here is how do we grow in holiness? And when we ask that question, oftentimes we're asking, how do I grow in private prayer? That's usually what the question is meaning. How do I grow in that private prayer? How do I grow in holiness? So here are 6 very practical tips for holiness. Okay? Ready for these? Here we go. Here we go. Drum roll, please. So, holiness is attainable. It's real. Okay? The first question, often taken for granted, is, what's your state in life? St. Francis de Sales, when he begins his introduction to the devout life, is, start with your state in life. If you're a mother raising 3 kids, the way you pray is going to look different from a monk in a monastery. It should. It should look different. So don't expect to be praying for 2 hours a day. It's not going to happen. nor should you just strive for that. Because what our state is in life, our prayer should always help support our vocation. So maybe that means that your prayer is 10 minutes a day if you're a mom. And that should look different from a monk. And that should look different from a widow. And that should look different from someone who's retired. That should look different than a student. That should look different from a priest. It should all look different in response to our state in life. So that's what we have to start with first. So who are we? What's our state in life? Second question is, often overlooked, what's life-giving for you? We often say, you need to pray this prayer if you want to be holy, or you need to pray that prayer if you want to be holy. God's made us all very different. So what gives you life? What recreates you? Right? What are those places or experiences where you encounter God? So if God has given you the gift of music, maybe that's how God speaks to you, through music. Whether it's listening to music, or playing music, or creating music, that can be a very practical way where you encounter God. Maybe you're a person who needs to write things out. So journaling is an important way for you to pray. By spilling your guts before God, by being honest with Him, being angry, but saying where you've experienced Him in your journaling. Maybe that's how you encountered God in the past. Maybe that's the way God's calling you to pray. Maybe you're a person who needs calm, meditative prayer. So a prayer like the Rosary, or a prayer like the Divine Mercy Chapel is important because maybe it helps you shut off all the other distractions in your life. It's repetitive, you kind of get into the feel of it. So maybe that's important, what God's calling you to. I know in different times I would go for a run, and I would pray the Rosary on my fingers as I was running. So, you know, I didn't run that long, so I would I'd only do half a Rosary, and then I'd turn around and then finish the other half. So that's when I knew I was like halfway. Okay, time to go back now. But maybe that's how God's calling you to pray. Father Tom is very good about going out to the mines of Spain and going hiking. He's very good at that. I don't really do that. I could be happy staying in all day or going skiing or something. So maybe that's a way that God speaks to you, is through nature and being alone in nature. Maybe another way is just reading. Reading different texts, reading different books is important to you. So what gives you life? Where are the ways that you experience God? It's a very practical question, but one we often take for granted. Okay. Next is create the space. We often sometimes forget that we're sensory beings and that space matters. When I first got to seminary, I thought, well, I want to get up early and I need to go to the chapel and I want to pray in the pews before Mass. And what happened was I would get there and I start going like this. And then I think, gosh, this pew is uncomfortable. And then I'd hear the people coming and going in the chapel. And I realized, okay, I need coffee. So that's the first thing I realized. And I need a comfy chair. So my wife's spiritual director priest said, well, just pray in your room. And so I did. And that's what I needed. That's my own personality. I need to pray. I need a comfy chair. I need coffee. And I need Liturgy of the Hours or a Bible. That's all I really need. So don't underestimate the importance of space. Create that space. Maybe that means also, buying an image or having a crucifix there, something to focus your attention, or a statue or something to create the space. Don't underestimate that. That's also cool when you're experiencing temptations too, to go to that space, to kind of get yourself out of where you are. Another thing is time. Figure out a time that works for you to pray. I'll tell you what, I had friends who insisted that they needed to pray before they went to bed. And I know people who insist, they say, every night when I go to bed, I pray the Rosary. If I did that, it would be in the name of the Father and the Son and the... For me, this is my own thing, the morning is the only time that works for me. As soon as I wake up, if it's not then, I'm going to fall asleep. That's just how it is. So I realized that in my own life, that it has to be in the morning. So figuring out what time of day works for you. Maybe it's driving to work in your car. Maybe that's the time you have, those 10, 15 minutes to just shut out the world, to turn off the radio. What's the time that works for you? Another thing is be consistent. Psychologists tell us that if we want to learn a new habit, we need to do it consistently 28 times. So 28 days. If you want a new habit, if you want to learn a new, cultivate a life of prayer, try something small for 28 days. It's a nice thing is the church gives us Advent and Lent to kind of do that. But any day, just know that it takes about that long for that to be consistent. So that's important. Be consistent. Do really small steps. Start out small. Don't start out with bigger chunks than you can handle. You can work up to that. You got a whole lifetime. No worries, right? So be consistent. The last tip. It's not about you. We kind of get tricked into the idea that prayer is about us. It's about everyone else. I just told some Waller students we were on retreat all weekend, and you know they had these very powerful experiences, and at the last Mass I said, guess what? This retreat had nothing to do with you. It wasn't about you. It's about your friends back home who would never have the guts to come on this retreat. And now you can give them a reason to believe. It's about your parents at home, right? So prayer isn't about us. And if we make it about us, it is not going to work. So offer it for someone else. So you're going to start a time of prayer and say, you know what, I offer this time of prayer for this person. Or I'm giving these graces to that person. Make it about them, because I don't know about you, but anytime I started a resolution for myself, January 1st, January 3rd, I forgot what I was doing. So make sure it's not about you. And reflecting on that gospel that we've been reflecting on all this time, maybe that conversion of the prodigal son was for the older brother. Maybe the reason that the younger son came to know the father's love was so that the older brother could have a change of heart too. Holiness isn't about us. It's about recognizing other people's need for God, and what's going to happen as we pray is we're going to become holy. It's the consequence of prayer. So, that's all I got. So in your worship aids, there are some reflection questions on the back side. So take a couple moments to reflect on those. Turn to the people beside you. Maybe you want to write down some things. Have a conversation with those near you. So you got 3 questions there. Go ahead and discuss.